I better introduce myself first. For those of you who don't know me, I'll come up here. I'm Les Borquin. I'm a professor in the Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition here at MSU. Been engaged in a great number of international development projects that primarily all boil back to helping producers and processors of food in developing countries comply with international standards or standards in higher value markets, build capacity for them to be able to more effectively engage in those markets. And over the years, that work has kind of led us closer to doing highly scalable training, the types of work that Chris and Karen and others with MSU Global here have been talking about, and eventually pushed us into a closer relationship with the World Bank and other donor organizations as we implement this. So it's really timely for us to be able to have Brian here to talk about the work that he's leading. Brian's a senior livestock and food safety specialist with the World Bank. He's worked internationally for really 3 decades in a number of countries, including China, various places in Southeast Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and Canada. He's currently based in D.C., so he's back in the U.S. After a very long time abroad. His special work that he's focused on in the past is specialized in livestock health and production, grassland rehabilitation, conservation, agriculture, and food safety. He is currently leading an effort within the bank called the Global Food Safety Capacity Building Partnership that he'll be talking with you about. I think we've known Brian pretty well for about the last 12 months or so, and he's really challenged our thinking in a lot of ways, and his work has had a big impact on how we approach this. And then there are others here at MSU that have a much longer relationship with Brian, so it's good to have him here on campus. So, Brian?
Thank you very much. Is this on? Yes. It's a real pleasure to be here today to talk to you about the Global Food Safety Partnership and how we at the World Bank and some of our other partners see this as a slightly different way to incorporate the MOOCs or open educational resources and online learning. Maybe just to put this in context, I'll give you a little anecdote from some of the work we're doing in Turkey. We're working in Turkey with about 5,600 companies to help them and the government of Turkey to prepare for EU accession. And as part of that exercise, we undertook, with our Turkish colleagues, a classification of these companies to see if they met EU food safety standards and what were the investment requirements in that context if they wanted to meet those standards. So we developed a little checklist, well, a rather comprehensive checklist, and then we ran through a test with the 2 very well-qualified EU experts and 3 of our Turkish colleagues to assess the value and how this checklist might work. After going through a particular kebab processing, a meat processing plant, we came back to look and evaluate the test and the checklist and how it was being used. So we asked our EU colleagues, how much would it cost for this particular plant to upgrade to meet the EU standards? They went through their checklist, had done the calculations, and estimated it would be about €1 million. So we turned to our Turkish colleagues, who were food safety professors, food science professors, very well qualified, who I respect very much, and we said to them, so what do you think it would cost? And their comment was, we're not qualified for this. I said, well, what do you mean you're not qualified? Well, our estimate is about €60,000. And the question to them was, why the discrepancy? And because they were in the plant side by side, all 5 of them using the same checklist, walking side by side to do the evaluation. And their comment was, we just don't see it. We don't see it with their eyes. And that's part of the problem we have, transitioning from sort of the knowledge part of it to the practical part of dealing with food safety and processing plants and on-farm around, around the world. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today, is a little different way to approach this and how we're trying to do this through this global partnership. Food safety, as many of you recognize and realize, is a global problem that's growing. And the World Bank sees this as a significant issue that's something that we should be engaged in. And looking at it from our perspective and how the World Bank operates, by the way, how many people know who the World Bank is and what we do? Does everybody have a clear understanding? Who would like an explanation quickly? The elevator speech. Okay. I'll give you the elevator speech. The World Bank Group includes the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the International Finance Corporation, and the International Monetary Fund. The World Bank, or the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is usually called, we are essentially a development institution with a banking license. Our main priority is poverty alleviation and shared prosperity. So we work in developing countries that over time eventually graduate out of the ability to borrow money from the World Bank or to receive grants from the World Bank. So we either lend money to governments or we give them grants to implement various development strategies. It could be railways or roads or hospitals, education. Some of you talked about some of the educational World Bank projects. And in this case, it would be for food safety upgrading and infrastructure for food safety. So that's who the World Bank is. So why are we involved in food safety? We're not a food safety agency. Being a global issue, over the last about 3 years, the main stakeholders globally approached the World Bank and asked us to take this on, which we agreed to do. And those stakeholders included not only the international agencies such as the WHO and the FAO and the OIE and UNIDO, the WTO. It was the private sector as well. Many of the big multinationals who come under GMA in the US or the Consumer Goods Forum, many of the multinationals and the big retailers that you know of, as well as many donor countries and the academic institutions who had a vision about how food safety should be changed globally. They approached the World Bank and requested us to help convene these stakeholders. They were struggling to come together under one common goal and to be able to work together. So the bank agreed to undertake this because it did fit with our mandate and our own objectives in terms of poverty alleviation, income generation, shared prosperity, and particularly those things around market access and global trade for the smaller farmers in many of the countries we're working in. Okay, this partnership started about 3 years ago, a little bit longer maybe, mainly in the APEC region under the Food Safety Cooperation Forum, which is a group of the 29 economies in APEC. And under that forum, they agreed to work together to drive towards improving food safety in the region. This was, over time, it was decided that perhaps this should be more global in perspective because the demand was global, and especially having the World Bank involved. And it was decided that really we needed to look for funding and really get the public sector and the private sector working together. This is the first time that the World Bank has ever established a multi-donor trust fund that is a public-private partnership. So we've already got funds from the private sector and from other donors to get this thing started. And moving in the direction of a global partnership and looking at open educational resources, which you've all been talking about today, and I'd like to discuss that a little bit and hopefully get some of your feedback. In terms of who the targets are, or what the objective is, we're looking at sort of 3 layers of food safety capacity building. The institutional level within a given country at the national level, the organizations at the private sector level and government organizations, and then at the individual level. Essentially what we're talking here is about changing behavior at the individual level, whether that's an individual working in a processing plant, a meat inspector in the government, or a farmer who has to decide how they're going to apply pesticides or insecticides to their plants. And that's the tricky part about getting from the knowledge delivery to behavioral change. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit as we go along. So the way this thing is structured is essentially the World Bank, we don't want to own this. We really want this to be owned by the partners involved. We decided to take this on over a 5-year period. We've set up a secretariat at the World Bank, as illustrated. Is there a mouse here somewhere? There we are. As illustrated here, under a 5-year work plan, during which we hope to transition to a broader partnership under a different governance structure, and that has yet to be decided or resolved. Because you can imagine the players involved here, it's a very difficult process. We're also putting the money in place to drive this partnership and carry on for many years to come. We don't see this as just a 5-year project. It's a partnership that others will own, not the World Bank. We've just been asked to help establish this and carry on well into the future to address these issues. This is the plan, as I've mentioned a little bit. There's a 5-year work plan. What we want to do is take this thing and roll it out regionally. So it's a massive scaling up of what's required. And to just maybe put it in perspective, the FDA has reported that there are 250,000 suppliers of food products from 150 countries selling into the U.S. That's just the suppliers. Then they have their networks of farmers and producers that are providing them with raw materials. In the EU, they estimate that's probably closer to about 300,000 suppliers. Those are the people that need to change behavior. That's the scale of what we're talking about. We tried to do the math the other day with Chris. Sorry about that. 2 million, and that's just a conservative estimate as far as we can see. This is the work plan, and again, this area over here on the left is essentially the things that have already been started under the APEC program. Some of the training programs that are being delivered in a more traditional approach. This middle part here is the scaling up that we're talking about. And dealing in what we've done is divided this amongst the 6 regions of the World Bank, where we'd like to establish the resources, as I'll describe in a little bit, in each of those 6 regions to scale this up and deliver it regionally. And you can see in the third column there, an important element is this learning platform, which we hope to invest in, that's going to be the knowledge base and the knowledge platform through which we're going to deliver many of these training programs. So the idea is we'd start in a given country, we'd work with the FAO, the WHO, the OIE, and the country itself to do a diagnostic on what the capacity building needs assessment and needs are in terms of training and capacity building across all of those sectors, develop a country action plan, and then do the training and capacity building at all of those levels that I've discussed. This is just a little graphic that shows you the step-by-step process, which we're hoping to go through, and we're starting this process in Africa, in Zambia, probably Kazakhstan. We have 5 or 6 countries going across those 6 ranges where we're going to start the work. The important part, and a number of people have alluded to here, is how are we going to measure the impact of this thing? I think Peter was talking about that and others. That's the real tricky bit. This is not just about delivering knowledge. Have these people and the individuals really changed behavior? Are they doing things differently? Is the rejection of food products to the US or to the EU, has the rejection numbers been reduced? So those are the kind of things that are going to be very difficult in this process. So going from the MOOC or the open line knowledge delivery to the practical training, and then determining whether or not we're really making a change. And that's really the important part of this at a scaled level. Again, looking at the 3 sort of groups, this is just to give you an idea. I'd like you all to memorize this matrix if you could. I will acknowledge... You need new glasses. The attribution for this goes to our friends here from the International Food Protection Training Institute. This is just one example of what needs to be done at the government level. This is the training, content, and competency list for government workers, starting at an entry-level inspector right up through to a senior manager. They've done a lot of work on this, and we're hoping to work with them and others to frame this up and use this in many of the developing countries. Just to give you an example, I believe this was done for the FDA. The catalog of courses to deliver all these competencies in the U.S. alone, I think they have identified about 700 courses. And I'll get to that in a minute. Safe food is not produced by governments, however. It's produced by the private sector. Companies produce safe food, and farmers produce safe food. So how do we get at those companies and farmers? And that's the next tier, is looking at the private sector, essentially along the value chain. They're one of the main drivers for food safety. This is one example of a program that's being used by the International Finance Corporation, by UNIDO, and by others. It was developed through the Global Food Safety Initiative. MSU and your staff here were intimately involved in the development of this program. And what it does is it takes a company in a stepwise process from basic level of meeting food safety standards to those higher, what we call food safety schemes. Those are the schemes that the international retailers such as Walmart, Tesco, even Coca-Cola, Cargill, Carrefour and others have established that their suppliers have to meet those food safety standards. So what we'd like to, or schemes as we call them, they're codex based, and what we would like to do is work with the private sector, and they're engaging with us on this, to develop a training plan as much as we can, do this online. Again, this is scaled up. We're talking 500,000 suppliers here, and there's some urgency. How do we do that and deliver the content and the knowledge through this network, using the content perhaps that has been developed under these programs, which seems to be working and which industry is buying into. The third level is down on the farm. How are we going to get to all of those farmers? Millions. I don't know how many millions there are. We saw some examples, and I really thank you very much, by the way, the presenters before me. This has been helpful for us in trying to look at how we might address some of these issues at the farm level. Particularly looking at how you would do on-farm gap programs and things just to tweak and change behavior, and so that farmers are bringing us a more consistent supply of high-quality, safe food into the processors. And this is going to be a big part of the program, is dealing with farmers organizations, and the networks, and many of them that you're already working with, that hopefully we're going to be able to network with. Again, if you break this out, and it was one of our Turkish colleagues that really said, the problem we're having here, it's not about technology, it's not about infrastructure, it's about knowledge, motivation, and understanding, or knowledge, understanding, and motivation. We're hoping that the knowledge and the understanding bits we can deliver and scale up through some kind of MOOC or some kind of online framework using this IT platform we've talked about. The motivational bit is much more difficult, and that's where we have to really get at how we're going to change behavior in all of these sectors as I've listed there, and using training, using technical assistance and education in a very applied and practical way to change behavior. Some of the things that we hope to invest in, and some of the resources we want to look at developing this open source IT platform. You're all more familiar with that than I am, but using some of the technologies that you've discussed here yesterday and today, obviously those things will come into play and will have to be part of this. The training, unlike some of the academic programs that you've talked about, needs to be very competency-based, and that's the tricky bit. I'll give you an example later of what we've been experimenting with, and which seems to be working. But how do you move these MOOCs into an environment where you really have to look at skill-based and competency-based training rather than just knowledge transfer? One of the things that the experts who we sit around the table with have been very clear on, there seems to be a consensus that 65, 70, maybe 75% of the content that's required is already out there. We don't have to develop new materials. People are tripping over themselves, and the World Bank, we've seen many examples where we're paying the same consultant to develop new materials that we've already paid 2 or 3 others to do the same thing, and they're all downloading it from the internet anyway. So that's the kind of thing we need to get away from that development cost and start spending the money on delivery of programs. That's really what our priority is. Looking at really demand-driven training, and I gave you that little example of what we're trying to do in more of the programs to the World Bank, particularly on the community-driven development projects, is we're actually financing the farmers. We're giving them the financial wherewithal to procure their own training needs. We help them do the training needs assessment in a very simple way, and they go out and procure them from the local extension workers, local consultants, university professors, wherever they think it's needed. And that we see is in the countries where we've done this, it's changing the whole dynamic, and it's stimulating a whole new extension service outside the government in many cases that's driven by this. And there's a feedback loop there where farmers see the benefit, see increased yields, increased income, and they're moving in the 3rd year of some of these places where there's a willingness to pay for this extension service because they're seeing the results. And I think we need to look more at those kinds of models. Again, the training we're talking about needs to be very in-service, hands-on, vocational type training to supplement the knowledge part of the training programs. The other part of this is how much of this is going to be free. How much, if you talk to the private sector and the Cargills and the Coca-Colas of the world, they're prepared to go to a certain level in the value chain to train their own workers within their own companies and the companies and the processing plants that they own in developing countries. They're prepared to go a little bit further to their priority suppliers. For instance, Cargill says, they have 100 and some odd suppliers. There are about 5,000 of them that are core suppliers that they'll train those also. So all of that other training, one might argue is a public good. That they can't afford to be paying $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 for a program. You know, a farmer can pay $10, $20. So how do we put this in a business model and package it in a way that it's affordable? Now, there still have to be public funding. There's no doubt about that. Donors, the World Bank and others will have to put some into this, but there needs to be some payback and some pay-as-you-go on the part of the beneficiaries. So how do we package this? And I think we've had some really interesting discussions here with some of the administrators and other people here at MSU, but how do they take their training model and look at it in a little different way, that they can package it in a different way that's more accessible and affordable in many of these developing countries. Maybe not always free, but a lot more open than it has been in the past. And we can talk about that if you like. The other part that we're looking at, and I've sort of put this aside a little bit because it's the academic part, and if you look at the long-term future, I know I'm speaking to the converted here, we need to get at the academic institutions. Where's the future? It's in the students that we can train who are going to carry on. So as a commitment to that, we're working with a whole network of institutions, including MSU, to develop a template for an international undergraduate curriculum for food safety and an international master's program in food safety as well, that again would be run and owned by the academic institutions around the world, working with institutions in developing countries to get that academic part institutionalized in many of these countries. Just to give you a little bit of a flavor of how we see this coming together, on the right side we've framed up here, this is the content. How do I get this? Well, okay, on the right side, the public side, that's essentially the content that is the public good, whether that's the FDA or the EU, DG Sanko, EU requirements, whether that's FAO, WHO, and the codex, essentially. That's the codex part of the food safety requirements. The other side is the private sector. These companies all have their own in-house training programs. It's Mars University, Coca-Cola, Pepsi. They all have their own training curriculum that we want to get and bring into an open platform, open access, open platform, and use some of the things we're seeing around you today to develop a repository of all of this information so that somebody in Kazakhstan wants to meet the requirements for exporting to the EU, they can go up and find out what the requirements are, and next they can get the training content in Russian, online. They can actually register for a program and have it delivered and get themselves qualified. Same thing for suppliers into the FDA. So that's what we're trying to develop under this platform, is the kind of repository that I've heard a lot of you talk about with all the tag data and so on and so forth. And have that in an open source. Now, there will be, we anticipate, that we'll might have to modify this in a bit. There'll be some stuff that will not be free access, that'll be paid for, that's proprietary. We'll have to allow for that as well. So we're really looking at, in the same way that we saw this ag repository from the previous speaker, hoping to do something like that in the food safety area. Sorry for that. Okay, let me give you a little example about how we see this working. Les and his team at MSU helped us to put together a generic HACCP training program that essentially aligned, it's codex based, aligned with what the FDA would require, something that would gets to the basics of the prerequisites and HACCP training that could be used in a developing country. It was translated into Chinese and delivered online through the MSU platform, the Food Safety Knowledge Network and Moodle and other things that they were using, in China to a group of academics, private sector, and government employees. Over a 1-month period, they did the online training, and hopefully sometime in the future, Les will be able to present some of the analysis, very interesting analysis they did about the participants online, and that was then combined with a 7-day program in China where they actually walked through processing plants and did the hands-on bit. That program now is being repeated by the Chinese in China. It's being done in Vietnam, in Turkey. It's demanded in Kazakhstan. We're probably going to do it in Zambia as well, in this traditional format, combining a little bit of the MOOC. What we would like to do now, and Chris has been talking to us about this and the team here, is to do this and really scale this up. scale it up in a way that it gets the knowledge piece done, but also has the practical bit done. Looking at maybe in the first go-around, maybe 1,000, maybe 5,000 participants. We're not sure how to do this, to see how we can combine the online knowledge bit with hands-on delivery of programs in country. So that's the next stage of this. And again, we see this as a global issue. The World Bank doesn't want to own this. We really need many of the people that are sitting in this room, for example, to step up to the plate and take ownership of this thing. We want to step out. We do have an exit strategy, as I've said. So hopefully we're just in the early stages now. Within the next 2 weeks, we'll have the website up and running. You'll be able to access that. And some of the stuff will start to now come into the public forum, and we can engage in this dialogue moving forward. So once again, I'd like to thank you all. I really appreciate the, and maybe you didn't realize you were giving us input, but you were. Some of it was very helpful, and I will be going back to Washington with some new ideas on how we might tweak this thing, and some of you may be hearing from us. So thank you very much.
Yep, don't get off the stage yet. We're not done yet. Thank you, Brian. You guys are such a great group, and we've gotten so much knowledge from your experience here, and I hope you found it helpful too, like, using AgShare as a real example. And here we have another example. Very different than AgShare, but it might even be able to incorporate some of these methods, right? So I thought it would be interesting in our last 20 minutes to share with you the design requirements and really get your input. What things aren't we thinking about, And Brian gave a great picture of the goals and what he's trying to do and the real impact. And I think this is a great design challenge. So here are some of the things he came up with in dialogues with Brian. We were estimating there are about 2 million people, and this is conservative, that need this kind of training across those different sectors. So this is farmers, processors, inspectors, the whole value chain for food of every category. And we think there's a big churn. This is not like 2 million and you're done, right? This is, what do you think the turnover is in processing and handlers and all that? So if you think of the annual churn, maybe we don't really know. 2 million every 2 years it turns over. We don't know. We're just guessing. So the other piece was, as Brian mentioned, this isn't about just automating the training. That's easy enough. That's not really the goal. The goal is to promote safe food behaviors across value chains, especially in developing countries. So around the world, safe food behavior, so we can reduce the amount of incidents, food safety incidents. This is about behavior change. Training only does a piece of that, right? We all know that. We want it to be very low cost. It doesn't have to be free, but yeah, drive it down to practically zero. And at the same time, which is I can't probably be totally free unless we use Nikos' 3-level model, which I think is pretty interesting. It's got to be financially self-sustaining. This is a new entity that will be created. It's not a bank ongoing project. It's meant to be seed. The bank is trying to seed with this public-private partnership funding, something that'll continue on, collaboration, association, foundation, whatever. So these are the kind of the big goals, design requirements, and then over here, I think you probably covered some of this. We're sort of like, what might the product be? We need, speaking of like the HACCP training, the HACCP training is like wash your hands level stuff, right? It's the very basic stuff that everybody needs. We need content that, yes, it already exists, but we need it kind of gathered together. And we do need stakeholders and other, people that train, people that are policymakers and corporations to agree, like with content review, yeah, this is good stuff. 80% of consensus that this is the main course. It's almost like this is the standard course for HACCP, and there's regional exceptions, regional standards and things. So you have to be able to localize it, not just translate in another language. It isn't about creating a standard can of tomatoes and then selling the can all over the world and changing the label. You actually have to change the spices in there. So you have to enable it to have the standard can that people can open up and add their own spices. So that's the localization. And there are 2 parts to a typical course now, bundles the knowledge piece and the assessment of knowledge, like with an exam, with the practicum, the skills base. It's usually hands-on or a tour of a physical processing facility, for example. So there's the knowledge. There's the assessment of that knowledge, sort of sound like MOOC, 2 million knowledge, assessment of knowledge, maybe. Then you got skills, and then some sort of recognition at the end. This is your certificate of completion, or maybe it's your certification. And this is where I think the Global Food Safety Partnership comes in handy, because the driver, and you want to talk a little bit about this, the driver for this kind of training is actually a complex set of carrots and sticks from the government policymakers. I wanted to give an example.
Yeah, there are a couple of examples, but you know what's going to drive somebody in Zambia to accept food safety? I mean, I give you the example. Let me take Turkey example. The processors are there; they know what needs to be done, but they're not doing it. Why would I spend $1 million, for example? I can sell my product out the door tomorrow and sell lots of it. So what's going to change what are the drivers and motivators? It's either going to have to be the government regulatory framework that is enforced and is enforceable. And that we do a lot of work in that area, in the policy area, working with food laws to align with either FDA or the EU. So that's one of the drivers. The other driver, which is quite frankly even more powerful, is the private sector. And if you look at the private sector companies now, and especially with the requirements for FSMA, but others, they're demanding, just in terms of protecting their brand in many of these markets, they're demanding that their suppliers, from farm right through to the processors, meet these food safety schemes. And those are very important drivers, and they're excluding the suppliers. So the suppliers are out there demanding that, not only are they demanding that we get trained in our processing plant, but we need to train those farmers, so they're bringing a safe, high-quality milk to the back door of our processing plant. Right now, I think I can tell you, we're working probably in the next, in about 2 weeks' time, we're meeting with all the big dairy processors around the world. So you name them, Nestle's, Campino, Danone, even Cargill, Coca-Cola, probably Pepsi. All of these, they want to sit down with us and talk about how they can set up a system that puts the drivers in place so they get that milk at the back door of their processing plants in developing countries.
Right, so the partnership will work with those levers and also work on blowing the doors off the current capacity of the current training system. Instead of having 45 people in a training, maybe we'll have 450, or maybe we'll have 4,000. So that's kind of what we're thinking about. The model, potentially, the business model, love your feedback on this, is maybe something similar to Straighter Line. However, how many of you are familiar with Straighter Line? Okay, so Straighter Line's a for-profit company. It's been around about 4 years, and it's one of those in the academic world that offers Psych 101, like your general ed courses, your first year and second year courses, for like $30 a course, $1,000 for your first year's worth of courses. It results in two things. It results in, if you pass the end of course exam, you don't get credit for it, right, for $30. But there's about, I don't know, we looked at the list yesterday, 30 accredited providers that they will accept your Psych 101 from Straighter Line in as transfer credit into their institution. So they'll say, we'll take that as transfer credit. And then there's another growing group of services that will create a recommendation, right? This is what Bruce talked about yesterday, right? So you don't get the credit, but you get a recommendation, it's in a pool, and then people who take that recommendation would give you credit. But the interesting business model is what they've done in Straighter Line, and what we might be able to do here, is they took the knowledge piece and the assessment of knowledge piece, the end of course exam and the quizzes, and they put it in the middle, scaled it up, put it all online, and drove the cost down. But in order to really make it valuable and to actually make, have it actually work, and in food safety, you need practicums, you need skills, you need providers that will link into this knowledge piece, but they'll be the providers of the practicum. So maybe now they offer 2 days of knowledge and 3 days of practicum in their standard thing for $400. Now, they won't do the 2 days of knowledge, they'll do the practicum piece, but now instead of serving 45 people, they actually have a market. If they can increase their scale, they could have 450 people. So that's a potential business model. And one of the questions we had for you guys, because a lot of you have extension, a lot of you do this, maybe not food safety training. How many of you do food safety training, actually? We're thinking of AgShare partner. You guys do. You're in Grand Rapids. It's in your name, right? Roof Forum. Do you have schools that do food safety training? Mm-hmm.
This is typical. What we see in many countries is they have a food science or food engineering department that by default does food safety. Just not sufficient, so we need to, so there's a real gap there. That's one of the gaps.
So that's
that we're seeing.
Programs of potential. Part of this would be, there are existing groups that could do these depending on the country and the context, but we want to seed even micro entrepreneurs to do this, and then maybe USIU with your agribusiness training and your entrepreneurship program. Can't sell food, well you can, but as the levers change, it's going to be something people need to do business. And maybe we could, set up AgShare partners potentially to play in this constellation around the core knowledge. So anyway, that's one business model idea. But the questions I have for you are a little bit more technical. And so this, please raise your hand and chime in. In order to pull this off and meet those goals over there and have a product that's knowledge and that's assessed and then has a separate add-on skills component, what do we need this system to look like? I think, Brian, you spelled out really well how you envision it, shared content. You'd like it to be open. You'd like it to seed innovation and to seed growth and capacity.
Yeah. If I could just there's some really innovative things going on out there in terms of skill development and interactive videos, the simulation, video simulation. For example, the MOOC model doesn't really work for laboratory training as it exists now, for example. You have to actually be able to do the test at the bench. And there's some of those hands-on things. Well, are there things out there that we haven't thought about? There's some things they're doing in the EU in terms of this face-to-face video training things that maybe we should look at.
Anyway, so this is just a quick brainstorming. Anybody have some ideas, things we should make sure we put on our plate as we're considering solutions? Terry?
I'd appreciate their contacts at some point if you don't mind.
Just linked to that, even with skills training such as lab work, it's possible to separate out the actual hands-on work from the introductory stuff you might need, such as lab practice, lab safety. There's a project in the UK based at De Montfort University that's been putting that kind of guidance and initial training as videos, as text, as diagrams, as all the rest of it, as OER, and that's proved to be really helpful in helping students spend more time in the lab actually doing important lab stuff and less time actually learning how to use the lab before they can.
Mine is a question. I wanted to find out how much work was done in analyzing the programs in Africa, especially those in food science and technology, in terms of the curricula, to sort of understand where the gaps are and what can be quickly done to impact on the people coming out of the universities in Africa, because there are quite a number of food science and technology programs.
Yeah, I didn't go through the details of this needs assessment, but the FAO and the WHO have combined to do a toolkit to do the diagnostic in a given country. The WTO also has what they call a multi-criteria decision analysis toolkit, and there are several others. So the way we would like to do this is go into a given country, which we have done in a couple of places. And the first one in Africa at this stage will be Zambia. There will be others to do this diagnostic. So what training is needed in capacity for government, for the private sector, for farmers, and including the academic part of that as well. And that's the stage where we will probably look at that the academic curriculum and try to see what it looks like compared to this template that we've talked about and what needs to be done to upgrade that. Then we would go into the working with the faculty and with twinning. We've talked about some twinning programs. Like the World Bank wouldn't do this. We would say, okay, MSU has a relationship with a university in somewhere in Africa. Then they would, through a twinning program, help to upgrade the food safety curriculum.
Because you talked about food suppliers supplying the US and the EU, I'm curious to know what component
Okay, I can't give you the numbers, but on the fruit and vegetable side, there are quite on the livestock side, it's very difficult, as you can appreciate, to export anything. But for fruits and vegetables, there are a lot of suppliers and networks, I know, in Kenya and Tanzania, In Zambia, the group called ACP, I don't know if you're familiar with them, some of you may be. They do a lot of work in that area. I don't have a number for you. We can try and find out for you if you're really interested. But I think there are quite a few in the fruit and vegetable area. Quite a few.
Thank you for the presentation. Maybe just a comment on one of the things that we were doing some case studies on. Actually, we were doing a case study on the flower companies and also the horticultural industry. And one of the things that we found out was that actually the legal requirements may not go as far enough, but taking it from a corporate social responsibility, whereby you have industry forming their own, again, monitoring mechanisms. They seem to be much more effective in achieving those goals. And maybe one of the focus is to see how the corporate social responsibility approach could also be part of the target, so that it's not just meeting the minimum legal requirements, but as part of a business practice, good business practices. And so through that process, then the effectiveness tends to be much higher than just meeting the basic legal requirements.
Yeah, what we're seeing is the more progressive companies are moving beyond the corporate social responsibility in this whole realm of creating shared values, as they call it now. I think Nestle's was at the forefront of that, but we're seeing more and more of that, I think. And it's interesting because when you talk to these companies and we make this suggestion to them, you've got this corporate social responsibility funds or the creating shared values, how can we bring that in to address these food safety issues? And without exception, they don't bundle those together. They treat them separately. So the corporate side, they've pretty well told us anything we want to do in this space with the company will come out of their corporate budget, not out of the corporate social responsibility budget. That they see as community-driven, social responsibility, that kind of thing. So we're still in discussions with them, but that's the basic answer they give us. Would you agree with that, Les? Is that?
A lot of the private standard requirements can end up being a jumble of legal requirements, food safety requirements, CSR types of requirements and aspirations, and then you have other things layered on top of it. And sometimes it gets very complex with regard to which pieces you're going to bite off and try and drive into the value chain. So things like fresh produce, coffee is probably the best example, where you have so many different certifications with so many layers to them, it gets really complicated. We've been trying initially to focus on what's easily non-negotiable, and that's why it was easiest for us to start with food safety, food manufacturing scope, which is well delineated in Codex, and we can all agree on that. But as we go into other sectors, it gets a little bit more challenging.
Brian, thank you so much for this very enlightening coverage. My comment relates to the farmers, particularly interested in the livestock farmers. You talked about contacting the major groups of, bigger farms and so on. But as you and I know, I'm sure you more than me, most of the food is produced by small and medium farmers, particularly in developing countries. Do you have any experience or any thoughts about how you motivate farmers who are not necessarily engaged in international trade? Nevertheless, they are producing the majority of the food. Do you have an idea how we can motivate them, with the word motivation, to keep those standards, the safety standards?
Okay, there's a common denominator for farmers all over the world, and it's money. It's not always money, but that's a very strong motivator. So it needs to be, if a small producer is just selling into a local wet market. That's a very difficult thing to get a handle on, unless you have a very stringent enforcement thing in the marketplace. And that's very rare in many developing countries, as you know better than I do probably. So I think only when either farmers or farmers as groups, the peer pressure within a group, farmers organizations, when they bulk up product to sell to a processor, and that processor begins to push for safer food. I mean, those are some of the main motivators, and the push for safer food is driven by an index of some kind that gives a higher price per kg or per liter for higher quality milk. So that's the difficult part we're having right now, is how do you do that? You can train the farmers in good agricultural practices, but are they going to change their behavior? Well, the moment they see, wow, my neighbor's getting a lot more money because he's delivering high quality milk, he's meeting the standards, he's making more money, I better change my behavior. I don't know if that answers, but that's the level of detail I think we need to get at, actually, if we're going to have impact.
Yes, actually, one of them was safety training. The food safety was part of the students, part of the package that they looked at, and of course the price of their products. But one of the things that I didn't mention is how they are motivated. Use a very simple mechanism. We had two charts, bar graphs, and we said this is how your milk quality is. And this is the average of the farmers in your own group size. And you're much better than the average of those farmers. And we do that on every other month. That one bar graph was a very interesting motivator. In fact, so much so that they are demanding that, why don't we have those graphs now? We also say, this is where you were last month. Third graph was, this is how much money, this is how less spoilage of milk you had, and this is how much money you made compared to the average. That, and we said, this is a sign of quality of milk. So you're increasing your quality of milk, but also you're increasing your bottom line. So yes, quality was part of it.
How would you scale that up now? Where was this project?
Well, it was done in Uganda. Well, we have not scaled it up yet. That's the problem, because it's a pilot study.
Yes, I've seen that we've been involved in programs like this in Indonesia and China and elsewhere, and actually in Malawi for a while, where we were doing the record keeping and generating these kinds of things. But how to get that scaled up and sustainable is always an issue. But yeah, you're right. I fully agree. That's a great way to get them motivated.
Okay. So from what I've understood, is you wanted to reach a lot of people, and they are a lot of farmers, and they are small farmers that are widely distributed geographically. And so here's another suggestion, that maybe we can build simulators, or you might have heard of the term games for learning. It's a huge sunk cost, but it might be able to simulate complex systems, like the process of getting the food to the distribution center and to the processors, that they might be able to understand that there is an important component that they keep the food preservation safely throughout the entire process. And it could also be that they might be able to use the simulators in the training in more of a community setting, to have the trainer organize the groups
for discussion after they tried out the simulation. So they essentially they get to fail a lot of times to figure out what the correct method is before doing it hands-on, like with the real food.
So one thing that when you mention games for learning and simulations, they cost a lot of money up front. I mean, that's not a lecture and a PowerPoint, you know, that's captured, or a video even. I mean, you have to anticipate a lot of this programming. This is high, very expensive stuff. But when you're talking about 2 million people or even 100,000 people, you can really, I mean, that starts to look inexpensive, right? So it'd be really interesting to see what the opportunities could be, where that makes a difference, and then how that changes that pedal model, right? The knowledge piece overlapping with the skills. I think it might change our assumptions when we can get to scale with those kinds of things. It might change our assumptions on how much actually has to be face-to-face, hands-on, to actually achieve the behavior change. So, and that's a good experiment. I don't know that there's an answer to that. I don't know if, are there any smart gaming people here? You and Ryan know a lot about that. But anything in the UK that you're doing related to that?
I attended a couple of years ago, and there was a guy from our government came along and said, well, okay, all this technology is lovely, but what we need is really attractive games, because that really enhances learning. And a lot of the time the presentation is kind of a red herring. It's possible to do simulation quite like stuff that looks less attractive, but it's much cheaper. I can't think off the top of my head of any really good examples of people using this in the UK, because I mean, even though it's still it's cheaper than doing a commercial use things. Again, it's still comparatively expensive.
Are there examples, Lee or Peter? Examples? Do you have any examples?
Yeah, one thing that's even designing and developing many of these IT tools or the gaming things are pretty cheap or cost effective in countries like India, where we have these human resources. There is a game that's a popular one, we all know, that's like a farm village on Facebook. In a similar way, like there is a Wonder Village, if that's a digital green, that's especially for the farmers. So that's being developed, and also initially that's for the trainers, like whoever the self-help group leaders. So they play that one, and also that's more like how they can make the development plans for the village. So in a similar way, like maybe we can bring up something for the food safety. We are thinking of bringing the similar kind of thing for the aflatoxins, where we focus on, so in the groundnut. So that's one thing.
I would check out, there's a website called Games for Change, and that's what they do. They make games for health and other applications for training and other stuff. There's a lot of crap, though, so just be careful. There's just a lot of low quality stuff. So, but yeah, the sort of half question, half statement that I had was, you know, money as a motivator for farmers makes sense, and their ability to change is often relates to their ability to access markets. And I'm wondering if this issue is big enough to convince politicians that maybe opening up access for markets for food producers in the third world so that they can actually be motivated by markets which are higher value. Is that can you make that argument to politicians, or are you still sort of, is it not big enough to be made yet?
What we call CASs, or assistance strategies, country assistance strategies. Without exception, now, if there's anything related to agriculture, it has food safety built into it, and that's the main reason is market access. They're all looking for that competitiveness, market access, diversification, those kinds of things.
But isn't limitation of market access often based on international trade policies?
Yes, it is to a certain extent, but if you can, let's take the EU for example. If you can meet the EU standards, and in order to do that, and what you see in the Europe and Central Asia region, most of those countries now are aligning their food laws with the EU food laws. And they've got free trade agreements now outside of the member states. A lot of them have free trade agreements, and under those free trade agreements, they have to align the food law. So once they've done that, then they're meeting that regulatory requirement. Okay. Now there may be some restrictions in terms of import and tariff barriers that fit in there, and those things we're working on as well. But yeah, you're right. The other interesting. Oh, sorry. Can I just make another comment? The other interesting part of this program is there are a lot of traditional institutions that are delivering these kinds of programs, and I think it doesn't matter whether it's food safety or whatever it is. When you go to a MOOC format, that can be quite intimidating, and they see that in some cases as threatening because you're moving away from their traditional revenue model, and it's a lot of money for some institutions, and you're looking at a different way of doing business. And this is sometimes a very difficult paradigm shift for many institutions, and quite frankly, we're getting in some institutions quite a bit of pushback in that area.
I'd like to go back to.
Go ahead, Teresa.
I'd like to go back to the question about behavior change and how to scale up some of the positive behaviors or changes that you've had through some of the pilot projects. And I'd like to say a word about social networks. Some of you might be familiar with the book Connected and the work by Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler. It's a Harvard MD and sociologist that teamed up. And they showed that not just your friends, but your friends' friends' friends, so 3 degrees of separation, influence your behavior the most. So what you really want to do is, when you're doing a pilot project, you want to identify who some of these influencers are, who's at the center of the social networks, because if you can convince them, they have the power to bring along the rest of their network.
And last one. Thank you, Teresa.
I just want to make 2 quick comments. One to the issue of markets as a driver, and I agree sometimes it's an access issue, but I think there's also a capacity issue with regard to the market. And the reality is everyone gets fascinated by what they think is the big margin in export, but the reality is that 99.9% of the people producing in these countries would be much better served focusing on local and regional markets that have higher value opportunities, and that's something we really focus on, and that's a really powerful driver. You've got to have it coupled to the market. Otherwise, if it costs you money to comply, if you put in all this effort and there's no reward, you get discouragement and you get no change. The other quick comment I wanted to make is this is not just a developing country issue, and I'll use the example in the U.S. with fresh produce. Unless you are selling fresh produce to the U.S. government for the school lunch program, you are exempt from basic food safety laws. There's no requirement. All right, that's changing under Food Safety Modernization Act. But in reality, even after all the FSMA rules for produce are negotiated in the U.S., only about 40,000 farms, packing facilities, are going to fall fully underneath those rules. 110,000 are either going to be fully exempt or partially exempt. All right, so it's a big domestic issue, not only in the U.S., but a lot of other developed countries as well.
Which is why that $2 million is conservative. There was one last question that I missed over here. Where was it? John? And then I'll turn it over to you after John to close.
I hope I had this correctly. In your need assessment, you said you're going to be looking at departments of food science and technology in terms of food safety. I don't know whether I had you right, but if I did, I think I would strongly encourage you to go beyond that, because the naming of these departments in African universities context are sometimes misleading. Food safety, in many cases, is not taught in those departments. You may find it in the Department of Animal Science or department in the College of Veterinary Medicine, food safety portion of it. So I would strongly encourage you to go broader if you are going to do this assessment. I hope I had you right.
Thank you. We're definitely going to put you on the working group that's working on this. Thank you. I think that's it for questions then.
Yep, that's it.
Thanks for your time. We really appreciate this. This has actually been very helpful for us. I always enjoy being with a group like this because it always opens up new avenues and new opportunities and begins to make the reality checks that we need to have. We tend to go forward too quickly, and after this meeting, I know I'm going to go back to Washington and sit down. We'll have some dialogue with Chris about what have we missed here and what do we need to reconsider. So I'd like to thank you all very, very much, and I hope to see many of you here engaged in this global partnership because I think it's going to be a very exciting endeavor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.